Rádi bychom vám představili prvního řečníka, nýbrž řečníci.
The first speaker is about to start their first talk here, and it's our honor to introduce you the one and only PhD in decision-making psychology, Rubyist by heart, software engineer at GitHub, teaching at Ruby Monsters Zurich and Rails Girls, Hana Harenc.
Hanka, jak už v angličtině bylo zmíněno, je doktorka psychologie a zároveň srdcařka Ruby, programátorka a software developerka v GitHubu. Jsme rádi, že vážila trošku delší cestu tady za námi, aby nám řekla něco o nových featurách na GitHubu.
We are very happy that she took the effort to come to Ostrava for this talk, such a long way. And we are going to start the talk now, and the topic is seamless releases with feature flags, insight from GitHub's experience. If you have any questions, you can ask them via Eventy or then later in the speaker's corner.
Ani?
Please welcome her on the stage.
Thank you. Hello, dobrý den. Tahle prezentace bude v angličtině, ale neskôr sa ma môžete kľudne pýtať otázky v slovenčine alebo v češtine. So today I'd like to talk about how we use feature flags at GitHub to release new features. Imagine you have your app. It's Thursday because, you know, we don't deploy on Fridays. And everything goes well, and then suddenly you start to see the errors coming up, and you see that the app is breaking, and you don't know. You need to deploy. It takes half an hour. And in that time, your customers are unhappy, and your page is broken. And what if you could change that? What if you would have a magic wand? And so it turns out you can have one, and it's feature flags. You can enable or disable feature flag in a second, so you can change how your app behaves. Can it save you from everything? No, but it can make a lot of deploys way less stress-free. So I'm Hana. My formal background is in judgment and decision-making psychology. I was also teaching paragliding for a couple of years, and then my daughter was born, and I stumbled upon a Ruby meetup, which is called Ruby Monsters, which is basically a free Ruby course for women. Then my son was born. It's not the same baby, they just look the same. And I wanted to do something which I can do more from home, more flexible, not very related, and I started to learn more web development and Ruby, and I ended up working at GitHub as a software developer, now for 1.5 years. So what you will hear today, oh, and I have stickers. I put this on the presentation because I always forgot. So if you see me around or in a speaker's corner, you can get some GitHub stickers. So today we will talk about feature flags, how we use them, how we use feature flags to ship a feature, which is called the default setup, and the last thing, how we use feature flags at scale. And now I have a bunch of questions for you. So who knows what feature flags are? Can you raise your hands? Okay. And who uses them? Who did ever use feature flags? And who uses them even today in their current job? Okay, nice. So I hope you will all learn something new today, which you can take with you. So when I say we want to ship safely and confidently, what does it mean? As I mentioned, you can disable and enable feature flag in a couple of seconds. And so you decouple the ship of the code and the deploy of the new feature. You also can enable feature flags for different groups. So you can enable it to specific actors or to specific groups or to percentage of requests or percentage of actors. In the simplest way, feature flag is just an if statement. So let's say GitHub would want to introduce a pet profile. it won't happen, right? This is an imaginary feature because many developers have pets, so we want to show between next to your profile, we also want to show some information about your pet. So we could have, this is the simple version of a feature flag. If pet profile for a user is enabled, we want to show information about the pets. Also, if not, we show the old profile, right? At GitHub, we are using a Flipper, which is open source implementation for feature flags written in Ruby, and we use it with our own tooling for deploys. So the feature flag check could look something like that. So we can check if the feature flag is enabled for self or the owner. I'm in the code scanning team, so often we check those feature flags for repository or for organizations. We also often have a disable feature flag, which seems like, oh, doesn't it do the same? But actually, you can, if you enable the feature flag for a large group of people or actors, but you have a specific actor or repository you want to disable with, that's where you use the disable feature flag. So the disable feature flag always takes preference. Let's say we want a feature, we enable it for the whole stuff, but we have a big repository which we don't want to use for testing this feature, so we can use the combination of enable and disable feature flags for that. Again, safe deploys. So we can ship the code incrementally, and we can decide when we want to deploy the feature, so when we want to show the feature to either us or the users. It also enables us to build incrementally, because many features are built over, some of them over weeks and some of them over months by multiple developers and also by multiple teams. So by having feature flags, this enables us to chip the work in small pieces and also test the work in small pieces. So everyone can work on their feature using the same feature flag, ship that to production, and then enable it just for them or for specific test users. And now, how to use the feature flag. So I prepared a bunch of examples for our imaginary feature. Let's say that we have a new method, which is pet details, and we want to always guard all the new behavior, but that doesn't mean that we want to guard every new line of code which was written in the code base. So if you look at that example, you see that in the pet details, we can return unless the feature flag is enabled. So that's the feature flag check. And all the other methods, method A, B, and some other helper method, are called from this method. That means that the other methods don't have to have feature flag on their own, and we make just one call to check if the feature flag is enabled. Let's look at the other example. So here we are creating a profile hash. And in the first step, we create a hash for the user. And in the second step, if the feature flag is enabled, we create a pet hash and then we merge it, right? And we return the profile hash with or without the pet information. We could also be tempted, okay, well, why don't guard just the last step when we are merging the two hashes, right? Because at the end, if we do this, if everything works well, the result should be the same. We should get the profile hash with or without the pet based on the if the feature flag is enabled. But the pet hash is also a new code, and this will run even if you don't use it. So if you introduce the bug there, or if you didn't run your migrations yet because it's your colleague who's doing that, you may break something. So you do want to put all the new code, which will be run under the feature flag. If you have views, so we use Ruby and Ruby on Rails, and many of our views are also in ERB, our ERB templates, and often we have a lot of logic in those views, you know, with a lot of if statements. And if we are introducing a new feature, which will change many places in that, it's better to create two different branches where you keep the else the old behavior in an else and the new behavior you combine. And then when you're cleaning that feature flag, it's just way easier to remove one branch and keep the other branch. What you have to do, you always have to check if there were no updates in the old branch, because there were usually many people working on the same view. And so here we can see if we have a component, view component is the first one, and let's say if the feature flag is enabled, we want to show a huge button. If it's disabled, a small button. And the same feature flag we do in a component to see which kind of text we want to do. So in this case, we are doing the feature flag check twice. Instead of that, you can create your helper method, which will memorize the result of the check and then use it in your component and also in the ERB. And like this, again, you gain a little bit of performance. And now, when we want to use the feature flag. In generally, we aim to use feature flag for all the new code changes and all the new features, and also for risky changes. We don't use feature flags for small changes which we can fully test locally or in testing environment. Also for bug fixes, which we know which we need to do right away. But again, this is really on you and on your company to decide. Like, it doesn't mean that everything what goes in the code base needs a new feature flag, because that would be a lot of work. But it's good to know, what are the risks and what are the gains. So what helps us to make this seamless and less painful is to have obvious test names. So always when we introduce new feature, we want to have tests which test the behavior with and without that feature flag. And if you just use this information also in a test later when you do a cleanup, it's way easier to figure out, okay, like what needs to be removed and what is the behavior we want to keep. We often memorize feature flag checks. It really depends how many of them you have in a code base. If you have just a couple of them, maybe it won't do such a big difference, but we will talk later about at scale, it can have a lot of impact. We also, because we have many teams, we have more than 1,500 developers, we make clear that it's clear which team owns the feature flag in a feature flag name, and to which project it is related. And very important, once you're sure that your feature works as expected, you just want to clean the code and remove it. Otherwise, it's really hard to work with it. Now I would like to talk about default setup. So it's a feature we worked for a couple of months and we shipped last year. And before, in code scanning, so code scanning is part of the advanced security products at GitHub. And what we do is that we scan code for vulnerabilities like SQL injections and similar. Before, if you wanted to set up code scanning, you have to commit YAML file, something like this. We prepared it for you, so theoretically you could just commit whatever we generated, but it was still a hurdle, because first of all, you usually want to understand what you're committing to your repo, and second, for people who weren't not developers but still would want to set up these security features, this was a big hurdle. So we decided that we want to make it possible to set up from UI with a couple of clicks. And this was the result. Now you can set up the code scanning with default setup. If you click on advanced, you go the YAML path. If you click on the default, you get something like this when you see for which languages it is enabled. And now there's also more configurability, so you can select which languages you want to use and which query suite you want to use. So let's look how we used feature flags to deliver this feature. First, we decided that we will build an internal API, which will make the testing easier for us if it works and if it does what we do. So there was one feature flag. We use this feature flag first in the monolith, and we also have some microservices connected to that. And because this feature was totally new, we didn't really needed the feature flag at that point in our microservices, because it was called from the monolith code, so it was guarded in the monolith. We also were thinking about what task we can do in parallel and what has dependencies. Then we had a separate feature flag for the UI work and backend work, and we also had, so we have protected branches, so we have different behavior for protected branches, and that again operated as a separate feature flag, worked on separate people in a team. And now we want to test it. First, of course, as I said, you want to have tests for both behaviors, feature flag on and off. You also want to do a local testing, or we developed a lot in code spaces, so we test there. Then we have different CI checks, and one of them runs with all the feature flags enabled. So this will prevent some problems if we have currently, oh, I can't even say, but like there are hundreds of feature flags. So different teams enable them on different times for different repos. So you want to make sure that those feature flags don't interfere with each other. And if that happens, you see it already in the CI before you deploy your code. We use review lab testing, which is an app deploy with the production data, but with your changes, with the new changes. Then during the deploy, we still can test the things in a canary. So while we deploy, part of the people are getting the new code and part of still the old code, and you can select, okay, I want to test this new behavior while we are deploying. And last test is in production, after we actually deploy. And that brings us to the shipping of the feature. As I mentioned, we have multiple stages for shipping. So first, we usually do what we call stuff ship, and this is the nice thing about dog fooding. So using your own software for work which you develop, most of the features we stuff ship to GitHub team, and like that we can catch many bugs, or we can collect feedback really early. Then for some features, we do private beta. So we have selected customers, and we enable that feature just for them. This is, again, very simple with the feature flags. Sometimes we do public beta. We can also do dark shipping. So we enable it just for percentage of users or requests. And the last stage is GA, so general availability. That is considered that the feature flag is shipped to all environments. And also, when you do all this testing and shipping, you want to have observability in place, because you want to see if there are problems, you want to see them when they happen. So often for projects, we create our own boards in a Castor and have a specific sentry queries to see if something goes wrong. And then, so on 9th of January, we shipped the default setup for code scanning, which increased the adoption of this feature dramatically. So it was really nice to see that people are happy with what we developed. But it was just the start. But let's talk about cleaning after we shipped the first version of the feature. It's really good to do the cleanup before you continue. So you want to remove the feature flags from the code, from the tests, and also from the tool you use. So there's one more thing you can do. You can also prepare the cleanup PR after you finish with the feature flag. This is also helpful when you have smaller features. And then once you're happy with how that works, you can just check that PR deployed and you're again clean. And that was just the start. After shipping that first version, we were adding more and more configurability so that our customers can decide on many things, which query suites to use. We were also, we created a public API. We were adding different languages for which default setup is working. We made it possible to select the languages. We enabled this setup on organizational level. And also we changed that we can detect the language changes automatically and change the workflow accordingly. And one of the last things was that we made it possible to change the schedule. And each of these parts of the feature had their own feature flags, and the organizational level setup had even two, because we were cooperating with a different team. So that brings us to the cross-team cooperation. So again, it's really good to know who owns which part, and in this case, we opted to create two separate feature flags because they were working on their organizational part, and we were working on the API for the organizational part. And these are all the changes we were shipping over the time. And so, to summarize it, we were able to use the feature flags both in monolith and in our microservices. They were used by different teams, and we have different feature flags for different parts of the feature. And we were gradually adding configurability to the default setup. And now I'd like to talk about the feature flags at scale. So there are two big issues with running feature flags at scale, and is how to scale them and the performance. When we started at GitHub with feature flags, long before I joined, we had the feature flags implemented just for the monolith. What that meant that all the microservices had to kind of send requests to the monolith to check if that feature flag is enabled. And you can imagine that it's not a great solution. So we developed our own tooling and made the same feature flags available from monolith and from different microservices, so we can use them from different code bases and different languages. We also implemented caching and preloading. Because feature flags are in input and output calls, they're expensive. So we don't want to slow our application. And this happens gradually. It's not like a clear cut. And what we decided that we can specify which feature flags we want to have preloaded on which specific page. And this will save us some performance. When we were shipping GitHub Actions, this was a very specific feature because it ran as a feature flagged feature for many months, and we were gradually adding the actors. And this one ended up having tens of thousands of actors. What happened that the website was, the page with actions was gradually slower and slower, and at some point it just led to an incident because there were so many feature flag checks that it was just too painful to work with. And that's when we implemented the concept of big features. So big features are features which we use for, in the cases when we have many actors, which we need to enable. And we want to make sure that we keep the performance. To talk more about that, let's talk about gates first. So I mentioned that we are using Flipper. And Flipper stores information about what feature flags is enabled through creating gates. Do you remember this? So we can enable feature flag either as a Boolean, so enabled or disabled for everyone, for individual actors, for groups of people or group of actors, percentage of time and percentage of requests. So in Flipper, Flipper creates a gate, so-called gate, for each of these groups. If you see the feature key, that's basically the name of the feature. On the third line, there's a key, so that's the way of enabling, right? That's the first one, Boolean, enabled or disabled. And then there's a value. So for Boolean gate, the values are just true or false. But if we look at the gate for groups, so way of enabling is groups, then the value is the whole group for who we want to enable it. The same can be early access. And then we have actors gates. So for each actor, Flipper creates a gate, individual one. And this is when the problem starts. And then we can have percentage of time or percentage of requests, right? So when we look at the feature flags, normally we implemented caching and querying for all these groups. So for actors groups, percentage of users and requests. And this works well for small features. For bigger features, we cache and query all the non-actor groups because they're not that big. And for actors, we query actors just when they're requested, and then we cache them separately. Because the problem, if we had like tens of thousands gates for individual actors, was that we use memcache, so it saved the key for that feature flag, which has many, many values. There were 500,000 of values, and every time you wanted to check for one user, you had to iterate over the whole array of values. So this is the reason why we decided to change this. And then when we load one page, we want to see information about our feature flags. As I mentioned, we use many feature flags. At one point when I checked, we were at one page of a repository, we had 99 feature flags, and 53 of them were enabled. And that resulted in 356 calls just for that one page to check if the feature flag is enabled or disabled. So if we load any page, we can see the information about how many feature flags on this specific page are enabled or disabled, how many calls we are doing, and the length, how long does it take to do those calls all together, which are enabled and disabled on this specific page, which from these feature flags we are preloading, and as the last one, which are the big features. So like this, we can also check if what we set up in the back end works correctly in the front end. So your company, you know them best, what you need, what will work for your team, what will work for your features. But I hope that you can take some examples and some inspiration of how we use feature flags to ship code securely and stress-free. But it's always important to find what fits you and your team. And with that, I'd like to say happy feature flagging. And if you would like to know some more talks about Ruby, we are organizing a first Ruby conference in Switzerland in November. And with that, I'd like to say thank you. And if you would like to stay in touch, I'm happy to connect. And also, if you have questions, we can do them here and later on in a speaker's corner. Thank you for your attention.
So we have a couple of questions here in Aventi.
The first question is, how did you get into GitHub?
Yes, okay, so on the presentation it often looks like, oh, it's a very straight line. So it took some time. When I realized I want to do some more coding, I started to learn more HTML and CSS. In the meantime, I started freelancing. As a developer, I was mostly doing like small websites with WordPress for small companies. And then I learned Ruby, and I wanted to do more and more with Ruby. What wasn't always the best fit for these clients, which I had, even though I was successful sometimes to smuggling in some Ruby frameworks like Jekyll or Bridgetown RB or Little Rails app, it wasn't really the best fit. So it was clear to me that I would like to do something else and do more Rails. And at that time, I got an email from Recruiter that were looking for some Rails developers. And I was like, I could do 60%. And yeah, from Switzerland, because I live in Switzerland. And they were like, OK, so let's try that. And I started to work as a Rails developer in a company called Ordelord. They were based in Bratislava. They were acquired by a US company called Reef. And that was my first professional experience as a software developer in a big company. And I was working as a contractor for a year. And after the year, it was kind of like a natural point for me to decide, do I want to continue with them, and or do I want to look for something else? And I learned a ton. I had the great colleagues, but also like there was a startup which they grown pretty fast, and I was at the end decided to look what is around, and I just stumbled upon the job ad on LinkedIn, to be honest, for GitHub, and then I applied. And then nothing happens for a couple of weeks, and after like a month or so, they got back to me. In the meantime, I was interviewing with 2 other companies, and I mean, after 7 rounds of interviews, I got the offer, and I decided to accept, so that's how I got there. I didn't know anyone before, but GitHub was always this place for me where Rails and Ruby is co-created, and I really found them a super interesting place to work, and also the culture which they promote. So I was very keen to interview with them, and that was another thing. It was a lot of fun to do that. Like, you know, interviews can be kind of stressful because the people are asking questions, and you don't always know all the answers, but I really enjoyed all the interviews and talks we had with all the people, which made me even more sure to that I want to work there.
Okay, so another question. Have you ever experienced a fuck up while deploying with feature flags? What was the biggest fuck up you experienced?
Yes, okay, so let me think about this. So I know we definitely had some at GitHub, but if I think about our team, so there's a thing which is generally harder to test, and that's how the feature will influence the performance, right? Because you can test something, you can just kind of try to mock it, but once you see when the millions of users start to use that feature, you can realize just then that, I know, you have too many calls to the database or whatever. And so, but the feature flags make this way easier because once you realize that, you can again switch them off, you can disable them, fix the problem, and then enable again. So, yeah, and in our team specifically, I can't really, I will think about that, and you can ask me again in the speaker's corner.
Okay, the next question is, who owns the feature flags? Is it a developer or a PM or Wolf team?
So it's the team. Each feature flag in the tooling we have, there's always description of the feature flag with a team who owns it with a Slack channel. So if anyone from GitHub has a question about that feature flag, they should immediately know where to ask. And in reality, yes, there are people, if I'm the only developer or one of 2 developers who created and develop with that feature flag, then I'm expected to answer those questions. But in generally, it's the team, because the team should know what we are working on too.
Okay, so last question at the moment. Do you ever run into problems only when certain feature flag combination is enabled? How do you avoid that?
Yes, but as I mentioned, we have this CA pipeline, which kind of prevents us to see those problems just in the production. So we usually figure out when we want to, you know, you finally got all your tests right. You push, you create your PR, and then you see, oh, one of these 150 checks is red, and it's this one. All features enabled. And it's not, these are often not easy to debug, because you don't really know which feature is the one which is interfering, so then you start to look and dig in the code and see, okay, what this relates to. Is there any other feature flag which is changing this? And so it happens, but we catch it before we deploy.
So there are no other questions right now in the app. Is there anyone here who would like to ask in person? We can give you the mic. No? Nobody? In that case, I would like to invite you all to join Hana in the speaker's corner. It's right there from this door. And for now, please run a warm round of applause for Hana. And thank you very much for being here with us.
Thank you. Thank you for your attention.